Well, good afternoon. It's Dr. Kremens here again. At the end of the week, actually, so I'll be putting up my usual end of the week update when I post this video this afternoon. And mostly, what I want to talk about today is the next set of readings that we're doing for class. And you'll probably notice from the little update I put the other day that I've changed things around slightly. I've decided to move any discussion of blight by Stuart Dybek until more closer to the middle of the semester, because I want to put that story from Dybek together with some of the Sandra Cisneros readings, which are excellent. I'm really looking forward to doing. But the more I thought about it, I thought it'd be good to group them together more in the middle of the class. And again, last year at this time when I was teaching 102, which I teach every spring, at Harper, I had put the Dybek and Cisneros earlier in the semester, and the Binder was actually later last spring. But the more I looked over, our assignments and started thinking about it, I just decided to move those around a little bit. So we're just focusing on Binder right now. We're going to go back to Dybek. We're going to have more on Sandra Cisneros in a couple of weeks, and Gwendolyn Brooks and some other writers. But Binder is an older writer, and you may be asking yourself, how are we going from something like Farwell or Blight, since most of you probably already read it, to a science fiction story or two science fiction stories? And the connection is, as you've probably noticed, is Chicago, the city, because Binder, like Dybek, like John Porcelino, who we're going to get to, and you've already seen his map, and like Gwendolyn Brooks and Cisneros and these other figures that I keep mentioning, they're all Chicago writers. The only writer we're doing that's not a Chicago writer is Inio Asano in Salonen, and we're going to do that book in conjunction with perfect example, the John Porcelino graphic novel, later in February. So, the more I thought about it over the last week, I said, you know what, I'm going to move Binder earlier, focus on him a little bit more, whereas last year I kind of did it in reverse. But Otto Binder, and that's the focus of the little video here that I'm going to give you today, is going to be the focus of our second paper. Okay, so paper number 2, when you start having a chance to take a look at that assignment. Some of you have already seen it, by the way. For those of you that had turned in papers this week, for my classes that are turning in papers next week, that's when you'll see the assignment for paper number 2, and you're probably noticing as soon as papers come in, I put up the assignment for the next paper so that you have plenty of time to think about it. But for all 4 of my classes this semester, I'm doing Otto Binder second, and I'm really focusing on him. This is a biography that the late Bill Shelley, a great historian, did a few years ago, and it's an excellent book, and there's Bill Shelley's drawing of Binder. And so I'm putting him together here early in the semester with Stuart Dybek, and we're going to think about him in relation to our next paper, because he is another Chicago writer. He was the child of Austro-Hungarian immigrants, German immigrants. They were specifically Austro-Hungarian, if you're being technical about where they were from. And so he has that similarity with Dybek, who is the grandson of immigrants. And so even though Binder is writing science fiction stories, like any good writer, he's still being inspired by his life experience. And so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about him. You can take notes on him. Anything that I mention, you're welcome to discuss in the paper topic for number 2 when you start thinking about that, or when you actually get a chance to read it. And I hope you enjoy the 2 stories, because the stories that we're focusing on now for the next week or so are going to be the 2 that are on Blackboard. Now, you're going to notice in the Otto Binder folder that's on your Blackboard site, there's some other resources. There's a set of review questions, which you don't have to turn into me, by the way. Those are for you to help you read the stories and to find details in them, and also to focus on certain ideas so that when we do a reading quiz on these stories, you'll have a map. I like giving those reading questions so that you have a way of highlighting and focusing on the main ideas of the stories that I think are significant and that I hope you find interesting as well. So you're reading right now would be the 2 Binder stories, I, Robot and The Teacher from Mars. They're in the same scan in Blackboard, so you're going to find them in the same PDF. You're going to see I, Robot first, because that's the earlier story. And then you're going to see The Teacher from Mars. So let me talk a little bit about him, and again, explain a little bit more why we're going to read him, and also how we're going to write about him, because this is the paper that we're going to focus on. Binder is going to deal with more research material, more outside sources. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Mainly today, I want to talk about the stories. So Otto Binder, as I mentioned, was the son of Austro-Hungarian immigrants who originally lived in Michigan. So they when they arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, about 120 years ago now, they originally lived in Bessemer, Michigan, and then eventually, because of the job opportunities here in Chicago, especially in the early 20th century, moved to the city. And you have to remember, early 20th century Chicago, there are a lot of opportunities for people looking for jobs. You have a lot of folks who are moving up from the South, African American families moving up from the southern states to find new opportunities and to escape all the really onerous and damaging Jim Crow laws. So while you have all of those families moving up from the South, you have all these immigrant families coming in, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe. Okay, and so that's why the early 20th century is the era of Upton Sinclair and the Jungle, which is about Lithuanian immigrants working in the stockyards here in Chicago. And so there's a rich history of immigrant literature starting in the early 20th century in Chicago and coming right up till today with the various Mexican-American writers, writers from African countries that write about their experiences in Chicago. So we're basically going back to one of these earlier writers who came out of that immigrant experience. But in the case of Otto Binder, didn't write autobiographical work so much as he wrote science fiction stories that drew on his autobiography. So again, he was born here to immigrant parents. He would have been one of the first people in his family to go to college, but he finished high school right around the time of the Great Depression, and that meant that his family did not have the money to send him to college. Initially, after he graduated from Schurz High School, which is still there, it's still over in right on the edge of the Irving Park, Portage Park neighborhoods on the northwest side of Chicago. It's a really big, beautiful high school. I used to actually live over in that neighborhood, and 120 years ago, those neighborhoods were almost like suburbs. They weren't even technically, they were part of the city, but they were much more spread out. The neighborhoods were larger. There were a lot of bungalows that were built there. And so that's where the Binder family lived. And after he graduated from Schurz High School, his plan initially was to go to city colleges and to study to be a scientist. But unfortunately, particularly because of the Great Depression, his family just didn't have the money, and he didn't have the money to be able to go to college. So he did not. He was not able to fulfill that dream, even though that is what he wanted to do. So as you can imagine, he had to figure out how to make a living. And he found out that he was a pretty talented writer. He was writing a lot for the Schurz High School newspaper. In fact, I even have some reprints of little stories that he wrote for the newspaper while he was still in high school. And he also developed an interest in science fiction. And at that time, in the 1920s and 1930s, science fiction was still a fairly new literary form. This is before the days we have now of Star Wars and all these other science fiction films. If you want to call, I know some people don't call Star Wars science fiction. It's more like science fantasy or like a Western in space. But let's just call it science fiction for the sake of argument. So Otto Binder became very interested in the early science fiction. So that means that he read people like H.G. Wells, who'd written The War of the Worlds, and Jules Verne, and these other late 19th, early 20th century writers who were just starting to create what we now think of as science fiction. Now, one thing to remember with science fiction writers is that they ultimately all look to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. That's, for a lot of people, a lot of critics consider that really one of the first modern science fiction novels, in which, again, the Dr. Frankenstein creates this monster from all these dismembered bodies, and he animates it through the use of lightning. Now, that book is early 1800s, but Binder loved that book. He loved writers like Charles Dickens. He loved H.G. Wells. He loved Jules Verne, all of those 19th century writers, and he particularly liked the ones that were more in the fantasy science fiction kind of a realm. And so when he began writing stories with his older brother, Earl Binder, they wrote science fiction stories, and they were successful at it. Now, one of the reasons for that, again, to get into more Chicago literary history here, is that one of the earliest science fiction magazines, Amazing Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsback, not a name you have to remember, but he was a major editor of science fiction here in Chicago in the early 20th century. He was the editor of Amazing Stories, and that's where Binder and his brother, and again, you may notice on the stories, it will say E. Ando Binder, which means Earl and Otto Binder. So that was their pen name when they were writing all these stories together. That was the pen name that they used. And they were successful. Otto Binder started making money. Now, his brother Earl was still working a factory job, and I'm going to forget exactly what kind of factory he worked in, but it was blue collar work that he did to support his family. He was, I think, the oldest brother in the family, and he and Otto were working together. Eventually, Otto took over writing all these stories himself because Earl just didn't have the time. And again, as his older brother, Earl encouraged Otto and said, "You're a really good writer. You're talented. You're more talented than I am. So why don't you keep going, keep doing this?" And that became Otto Binder's career. So again, there was some early disappointment in his life. His family could not afford to send him to college. And so what he did is he took his love of science, his love of literature, his love of science fiction writing, early science fiction writing, and he turned it into a lifelong career. And so by the mid 1930s, he has published stories like I, Robot, which you're going to be reading. By the end of the 30s, he's published what he always said was his favorite story that he ever wrote, which was The Teacher from Mars. And that's why I've selected those two stories. I, Robot, which comes from, this is a later collection of some of the robot stories that Binder wrote, was one of his first big successes. It was published in Amazing Stories. I'm going to forget the year now. I think it was mid 1930s. I'd have to look that up again on my shelf in my some of my biographies on him. Very successful. He was a very popular, again, 1930s science fiction writers. And one thing you're going to notice when you read him is that his stories were always what would be called an allegory. Now, what does that mean? An allegory is a story that has some kind of a moral lesson that it is trying to teach you. It often does that symbolically. So in other words, you can read an allegory, which is almost like a fable. So if you know Aesop's fables, for example, or if you know the parables in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, for example, those are all allegorical stories. They're often short. They have symbolic elements, and they are supposed to give you some kind of moral lesson at the end. That's why they're so often written for young kids. Not in all cases, like the parables, for example, like in sacred texts. But often allegories are written for a slightly younger audience because you're trying to communicate some kind of a moral, some kind of a lesson to the reader. And Binder, because he typically wrote for slightly younger audiences, these two stories that you're reading were for both younger and adult audiences. These stories, I, Robot, and The Teacher from Mars were really just for anybody that read those old pulp science fiction magazines of the 1930s. Unfortunately, I don't have any of those magazines, by the way, from the 30s because they're old and they're hard to find. But these are the kind of magazines I'm talking about. This is from the early 50s, and this has a Binder story in it. This is called Galaxy Science Fiction from January 1952. So these were these inexpensive, this was 35 cents, which even back in 1952 was not that expensive. And so these were these little magazines that people would pick up. This is in the days before you had television being widely available. Radio and movies were popular, but people read a lot of these science fiction magazines, mystery magazines, romance magazines. That was the popular culture. We don't have as much of that today because we have more television and streaming services and a much more sophisticated movie industry than they would have had back when these things were being published. But back then, you could make a living writing these kinds of stories. But Binder didn't only want to write fantasy stories. He wanted them to have that allegorical meaning. And again, an allegorical story is something that has a moral lesson, that has a lot of symbolism in it, that you can read on the surface level, purely as an adventure story, purely as a fantasy story. But underneath the surface, especially for Binder, there are these other ideas that he wants to convey, these moral ideas, these ideas of civic duty and companionship and friendship, again, a big theme of the course. And so to just talk a little bit about I, Robot, the first of the two stories I want you to read by him, it is a version of Frankenstein, and you'll notice that. Read carefully, and you're going to see he puts a reference into Mary Shelley because he admired her work so much. And so this is sort of a version of Frankenstein, but a sort of futuristic version of it. He does develop friendships. I don't want to give too much away of the story if you haven't read it yet, but the Adam Link, the main character, is trying to learn how to be human. He's a robot. He's a machine, but he wants to learn to be human, and he starts to realize that he's developing emotions, he's developing nostalgia, attachments, feelings of friendship, not only for the doctor who created him, but also for the doctor's little dog, which again, I won't say too much about the dog yet either, although you'll see on this cover of this 1960s version, there's Adam Lincoln, the dog, right? And so it is a story about friendship, but it's also a story, and again, I won't give away the ending yet, about bullying, about prejudice, and you probably noticed that in the way the other human beings treat Adam Link when they accuse him of a murder that he didn't commit. And again, I won't say anything else about that until you read the story. So it's an allegory about tolerance, about friendship, about what it means to be human. And not only what it means to be human, but also what it means to have compassion for other human beings who are trying to learn their way through the world. And so that's sort of the meaning in that story. And if you've read The Teacher from Mars, which again was originally published in a magazine in the 1930s, I don't have a copy of that. If I did, it would be really expensive. They're really hard to find. But this is a reprinted version of Teacher from Mars from the 1950s. And this is the book, by the way, where I took the scan from. And Munzeros, the main character in The Teacher from Mars, again, is looking for a way to fit in. And if you read the story carefully, you'll notice that when he arrives on Earth from Mars, where does he end up? Chicago. And he thinks he's going to stay in Chicago. In fact, I think he's looking forward to it because it's going to be a city. It's now, and again, this is a futuristic version of Chicago. But then he ends up having to work in Indiana, and he goes to, I guess, a more rural part of Indiana, and he runs into some problems, as you know, if you've read the story, from some of his students who don't look at him as being like them, and so they also bully him. You see that pattern emerging in these stories, these outsiders who come in from, well, in iRobot's case, he's actually created like Frankenstein or Frankenstein's monster. And in The Teacher from Mars, it's the same thing. This is a Martian teacher. He arrives on Earth, first in Chicago, then goes off to Indiana to teach students. He's very committed to his job, and then runs into some problems. He runs into prejudice again. He runs into this kind of bullying from his students. All kinds of things happen to him. And again, next week when I do another video about this, when you've all read these stories, I'll give away a little bit more about the endings of them. I don't want to say too much else about that now. But the themes are very similar. So I want you to think of these in terms of Binder's own background that I just mentioned. He's the child of immigrants, a working class family that was trying to make their way in the United States, moved to Chicago for more opportunities, and they found some opportunities here, but they didn't quite find the opportunities that were going to provide them with enough income and enough stability to be able to send all their children to college. And so then Binder discovered his writing talent, and through the encouragement of his older brother, Earl, developed that talent. Not only was he a widely published science fiction writer in the 1930s, creating these very allegorical stories that he hoped would convey these lessons of tolerance and companionship and friendship to his audiences, but he also became an agent. I was going to say an editor, but he was more of an agent for some other science fiction writers and fantasy writers. In fact, he worked for Robert E. Howard, who created the Conan the Barbarian character, if you've ever seen those films. He worked for another writer named H.P. Lovecraft, who was a pretty well-known horror writer. He was their agent, so he would help them get their stories published. By the early 1940s, he was working in comic books, so he took all of his success from working on these science fiction stories, and you probably know some of the characters that he co-created. In the 1950s, Binder co-created Supergirl. He created Krypto, who is Superboy's dog in the comics. He created Brainiac, who is one of Superman's villains. Black Adam, by the way, who Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, one of my favorite actors, will be portraying in an upcoming DC film. That's an Otto Binder character that was created with the artist C.C. Beck. So in the second half of his career, he was still writing science fiction, but he was also writing these comic books. He wrote Captain Marvel comics, they're better known as Shazam today, Superman comics in the 1950s, all the way through the 1960s. And that's why you'll notice in Blackboard, I've put up a couple of the comic book versions of these stories, which I hope you'll enjoy. He did adaptations of his own work in the 1950s that were published in these kinds of comics, weird science fantasy, weird science fiction stories. Later in his life, I just want to mention a couple of other things about him. He also wrote nonfiction. He still loves science. Okay, and that's why I like teaching him, because for those of you that are science majors or going into science, he wanted to be a scientist. He loves science. He loves space exploration. He was so excited when we started to see more use of satellites and the push to get to the moon in the 1960s. He was very excited about that. He wrote books and articles about NASA, about space travel, about the moon. So he kept up with that interest. One of his last books actually is even about flying saucers. Do they exist? Do they not exist? This is one of his last ones from the early 1970s. So he never let go of that love of science. He just used it to inform his writing and his fiction and even some of his nonfiction. And so he was a professional freelance writer for his entire career and was pretty well regarded not only as a science fiction writer but also as a comic book writer. One other little footnote about Otto Binder for those of you that enjoy the Marvel movies. I think he's the first one to write a novel about the Avengers. This is from 1969, so he was hired by Marvel Comics to do this novel, not a graphic novel. It's a novel with Captain America, the Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, that's Quicksilver, and Giant Man or Yellow Jacket or whichever name. There's a number of different names of that character, and Captain America. So this is from 1969 for those of you that are Marvel Avengers fans. Otto Binder, and you'll see his name here on the spine. He was under his own name, not the E. Ando Binder one. Late 60s, wrote what I think is the first novel about the Avengers. Hard to find. I found this a few years ago, cheap, and I picked it up. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. Really, really good book. Very entertaining with some cool characterizations of these Marvel superheroes. Okay, so there's Otto Binder. He's our next writer. Again, why are we going from someone like Dybeck to Otto Binder? Well, because first of all, for your next paper that you're going to be working on, for paper number 2, which we'll talk about more next week, you'll have a lot of research sources on Binder that I'm going to be sharing with you, so that you'll be able to incorporate ideas on him into our next paper. But also, it's the Chicago connection. He's the son of immigrants who, much like Dybeck's grandparents, got here to Chicago. Much like Babovich, for that matter, got here to Chicago for new opportunities, but he just took a different path. Unlike Sandra Cisneros, who we're going to go into next, and John Porcellino, and those other writers who were writing about their lives specifically, he was still drawing on his experiences, probably his experiences of being the son of immigrants and not always fitting in, being rejected, perhaps being bullied by other kids. Who knows, in his schoolyard. I don't know a lot about his childhood. I know more about, again, as I said, his high school years. But I'm sure that they had very difficult challenges when they first got here to the city in the early 20th century. So that's what he was drawing on when he was writing these allegorical stories about tolerance and about these characters trying to make their way through this bullying. Again, I keep using that word, that they're experiencing from the people around them and the prejudice that they're experiencing. That was a major theme throughout his whole life, throughout all the stories that he ever wrote, stories for adults, stories for kids when he was writing the comics. So he's an interesting writer. By all accounts, was also, just a good person. I don't know. Everything I've ever read about him said he was committed, to just doing his writing the best that he could, providing for his family as best he could, and just trying to tell good stories that people would remember and still talk about. And we're still here talking about them. So I think he succeeded in that. So I hope you enjoy them. If you have any questions at all when you're reading them, please let me know. One last footnote. Geez, I'm remembering all these things that I'm forgetting to mention. If you've seen the Will Smith movie, I, Robot, that is based on Isaac Asimov's book, which is also called I, Robot. Here's Isaac Asimov, one of his books. So that title was borrowed from Binder. Isaac Asimov, who wrote the other I, Robot that was then turned into the Will Smith movie from probably 15 years ago now. That was all based on Binder's robot stories. Okay, so in fact, Asimov had to write to Binder and say, can I use that title? My publisher wants us to use it for my new book of robot stories, but you're the first one. You're one of the first one to write stories about robots or at least robot stories based on Mary Shelley. And Binder, gracious as always, said, sure, go ahead, use the title. I don't mind. If it gets more people to read my stories, then let's do it. Go ahead and make use of it. And so, again, if you've seen I, Robot, there's a little bit of Otto Binder in there too. So his influence is still there. It's still out there in the world. So it just goes to show, if you follow your dreams, as he did, even if it seemed like he was getting off track and couldn't go to college and couldn't develop that dream, he found another one and he pursued it and he was successful at it. And that's why we're still reading his stories today. And, one last thing I'll mention, I think his stories still have a meaning that's resonant. I think the allegorical meaning in these stories is still very, very relevant today. And so I want you to think about that as you're reading them. And again, most of all, I want you to enjoy them. They're fun. They're a little different than any of the other pieces we're going to read this semester, but they're still grounded here in the greater Chicago area, which is where he got his start. All right. So again, I hope you have a good weekend. I hope you enjoy the stories. Please email me with any questions about any of the assignments. Be careful. Looks like we're going to get more snow this weekend too. So my shovel's already ready out on the back porch here. So we're going to get ready to probably do a little shoveling this weekend. Okay. So take care, and I'll see you again on Monday. Bye.